to determine is this a real story or not a real story, you have to look at the entire circumstances and say, could this have happened? You know, was society at a point where this could have even taken place? And sometimes you find out that things were mythical or things were legend, but there wasn't much truth to it because they couldn't have happened the way the story goes. All right? With the Knights of the Golden Circle, a lot of people say, well, I don't believe they existed and had all that gold because there wasn't that much gold around. And they're discounting the amount of Spanish gold that was mined in this country or moved through this country and subsequently hidden. They're discounting the amount of gold that was smuggled out of gold mines and never recorded. In documenting something like this, you have to look at the full set of circumstances, because the claims are that there were several 100,000 members of the Knights of the Golden Circle throughout the United States, England, France, Canada, and Mexico. The vast majority of the bottom line Knights of the Golden Circle members, the gophers of the group, you know, the hundreds of thousands of people in this country, they could have existed, and they did exist because the conditions were ripe for it in this country. In the first class, I started out saying that in the late 1700s, they had more or less agreed that there would be no more slaves imported into this country, and slavery, they kind of wanted to limit it, but they said you can keep what slaves you've got, you can sell slaves back and forth, you can move them back and forth. So there wasn't too much of a problem between the North and the South. There were economic problems between the North and the South. There were problems because of tariffs, because of unfair trade relations that they had. These were minor problems that they were trying to compromise and work out. The original southern states that were being used for cotton and tobacco were up in these areas in here. Sometimes that's referred to as the Old South. You've got to be real careful when you're reading magazine articles on the Civil War or on the history that there's references to the Old South and the Deep South, or sometimes they say the South and the Old South. Everybody thinks the Old South means just the southern plantations and everything below a certain line. That's not true. There was an Old South which was in the area of Virginia, North Carolina, parts of Tennessee, this area here, which was the oldest settled South. All right? There is a difference. Now, the South, the people that ran these plantations came over to this country with a background of aristocracy. They came from Europe, and they believed that there was a ruling class of people, and they believed there was a servant class of people, no different than the situation where you have with kings and princes and dukes and queens and a servant class. They came from this mindset into this country, and they began to set up plantations that would mimic the old aristocracy that they had left behind in Europe. Now, part of the wealth of the South was that when these things were brought over and the plantation owners started making money, the finest of everything that was in Europe was being sent over. The finest paintings, the finest porcelain, the finest china, handmade goods, things imported from China, things that came in from all over the world were being imported to these plantations, and these plantation owners had lavish places. And it was part of their society that they tried to mimic the old aristocracy and the old ways of doing things and the old attitudes. There was great politeness. There was great respect for the dignity of their fellow people. They had the idea that Northerners were very rude. By comparison, they were. The Northern people had taken more of a entrepreneurial outlook on the establishment and the settling of this country. They were going in a different direction that was more oriented toward the common individual without so much of a class distinction. Now, as the plantation owners used up this land, they burned it out because they didn't do any crop rotation. They didn't know those techniques back then. So this land got burned out. As it got burned out, they would move a little bit further south. They would move the slaves, move the operation, and they would abandon the land behind them. And they had to keep on moving south. Every few years, another field would be burned out, and they kept moving south. Well, there was a limit put on where slavery would go. First off, one of the limits, and I'm not going to get into all the dates of this, one of the limits was it would stop at the Mississippi River. Another limitation was that it would stop at, 3630, or is it 3036? At any rate, it's a degree line that cuts just about, I think, around Knoxville, Kentucky, hereabouts, that all the states above this would be free and all the states below it would be slave states. Now, the biggest problem was that no one was coming into the South from Europe. They were all going to the northern industrialized communities to work. So you had boatload after boatload of immigrants coming in. And this began to upset the balance of power in the House of Representatives. And the South was losing more and more votes, and the North was gaining more votes. And finally, it got to a point where the North had enough votes to literally stop anything that the South wanted to do. The South wanted to continue moving this way with their plantations and their lifestyle and their culture, and the North would stop them. The legislators would stop them because they didn't have the votes to pull it off. And this was pushing the basis for secession from the country for a long time, that people began to grumble, they began to get resentful, and this was in the 1820s when this was already taking place. And as this balance of power became worse and worse, there was more and more talk that the South should just form its own government and do what it wanted to do. So this whole thing about the Civil War, and it was caused by the secession of North Carolina and everything, and that's what caused it. It wasn't. This was a low-burning fire for a long time with these people. Now, as they got to a point where they had moved about as south as they could without getting any new land, when it came to annexing Texas, they fought that Texas should be a slave state, and the North fought that it would be a non-slave state. Well, this came, I don't want to get ahead of myself, this came to a head when in about 1830s when it started, 1830, Andrew Jackson imposed tariffs and taxes and so forth on the people of North Carolina and the government of North Carolina, claiming that it was for certain to pay for certain public works that was taking place in the North. Normally this wouldn't make any difference, except that North Carolina had been denied public money for their own works by Andrew Jackson earlier than that, and they were very, very resentful that they were being forced to pay for something in the North when they wanted something done, they couldn't get it done. And Jackson said, you are in the Union, you will do what we say, you will pay what we tell you to pay. And at this point, North Carolina threatened to secede from the country, and it began an operation to do so. Andrew Jackson backed down on it and compromised once more with the people. But at that point, when this took place, there were merchants in the North, and this is what many people don't realize, there were merchants in the North as well as plantation owners in the South, as well as money backers in Europe, that said, this is not going to work. The Northerners, the merchants in the North, depended on the cotton as raw materials for their manufacturing, which they then shipped out to all places in Europe, the things that they manufactured with that cotton. If the cotton plantations were to come to an end, the merchants with their machinery and their equipment would come to an end. The two of them worked hand in hand. One fed the other. So it's not like all these Northerners are sitting up there saying, abolish